as to the fate of the Prime Minister. Mr. Holt went for a swim shortly after noon with a friend, Mr. Alan Stewart, a quarantine officer from the Melbourne suburb of Armadale.
There was a time when, to know what was happening in the world, people turned on the radio, spread the morning paper out on the table, or waited for the news bulletin on a black and white TV in the lounge room. On most nights, Harold Holt, the Prime Minister of Australia, would appear, shaking hands in the sun, smiling next to the US President, speaking sternly about the war or the new currency. A familiar, healthy face that seemed like it would be there for a very long time. No one imagined that just a few months later, the evening news would announce the Prime Minister had gone into the sea and not come back up. On the morning of Sunday, 17th December 1967, at the Holiday House in Portsea, Holt's day began quietly. The schedule was simple. Take a few friends for a drive along the coast, stop at Cheviot Beach, a military-controlled area, watch the waves, then head home for lunch. No meetings, no media, just a man about to turn 60, wanting to breathe in some sea air before the new working week. The group drove the red Pontiac to Cheviot Beach. From the edge of the sand, the scene looked like a postcard. Yellow sand, white surf, strong wind, the water a greenish blue churned brown where the sand was being dragged up. But to anyone who knew the sea, it was beauty with a warning attached. Hidden rocks, powerful currents, a dangerous shoreline. Lifesavers regarded it as one of the most treacherous beaches in the area. Towards midday, they walked down onto the sand. The wind stung, the waves rolled in with white foam. A few people looked at the water, shook their heads, and were certain it was far too strong that day. They stayed back on the shore. Holt took off his shirt, left in just his bathers and canvas shoes, and looked out to sea with the confidence of someone who had come here his whole life. He had dived, spearfished, and had even nearly come to grief in this very spot before. When someone mentioned the sea wasn't safe, he only joked that he knew this beach like the back of his hand, then stepped into the water. He slipped through the first sets of waves, swimming on a diagonal line towards the area with the strongest rip current. From the shore, they could still see his head and shoulders bobbing between the foam until the waves grew high enough to block him from view. Then, everything happened in almost a single beat. A powerful wave crashed over the area. When the foam cleared, Holt was no longer where he had been. One person in the group tried to dive in after him, but was dragged back so hard by the current that he had to turn around. There were no cries for help, no visible struggling. Holt vanished into the surf. Within minutes, Cheviot Beach became a national incident site. Helicopters beat the air overhead. Rescue boats ran along the shoreline. Navy vessels searched offshore. Divers checked each rock gutter. Across Australia, people turned on the radio, switched on the TV, and heard the sentence that shocked the entire country. Prime Minister Harold Holt was missing at sea. The search operation went on for many days, becoming one of the largest rescue efforts in Australian history. But the sea gave nothing back. No body, no trace. In the end, the government had to accept that Holt had drowned in extremely dangerous conditions, even though there was no recovered remains. The fact that Holt had been the man backing the United States in the Vietnam War, the Prime Minister who oversaw the shift to decimal currency, the face of the 1967 referendum, made this ending even harder to accept. That gap opened the door to countless theories: suicide, escape, foreign submarines, the CIA. But official investigations delivered a cold conclusion. There was no evidence of a conspiracy. The most likely explanation was a drowning accident involving a man with declining health who was far too confident in the sea. In the Australian memory, Holt became the Prime Minister who disappeared in the waves, a fade-to-black ending prepared by a lifelong love of the ocean and a 3-decade political career. This is only the beginning. Follow Farewell Aussie Stars to dive into the life story of Harold Holt, from childhood and his path to power, to the warnings that were missed before that final fade to black. Harold Holt, the man who would later become the Prime Minister who vanished in rough surf, began life as a boy born in 1908 in Stanmore, a suburb of Sydney, the son of 2 public school teachers. His childhood was tied to constant school changes as his parents moved for work, from Sydney to the rural town of Nubba, then Adelaide. When his father became a cinema manager in Melbourne, Harold was sent as a boarder to Wesley College, an environment that shaped his defining traits: love of sport, a talent for arguing, and a natural ability to lead. In the late 1920s, Holt studied law at the University of Melbourne, both to have a stable profession and because law was the fastest pathway into politics, a field he had been interested in from early on. After graduating, he worked as a lawyer for a film company, then as a lobbyist for cinema owners, a job that forced him to deal with many different interest groups. His neat appearance and easy, personable way of speaking quickly made him the kind of face political parties wanted to recruit. In the early 1930s, with Australia still struggling in the aftermath of the Great Depression, Holt formally entered politics through the Young Nationalist movement of the United Australia Party, UAP. In 1934, he ran for federal parliament for the first time and lost heavily to former Prime Minister James Scullin. But his energy got him noticed by party leaders. After another defeat at state level, he succeeded on his 3rd attempt. In 1935, Holt won the by-election for the seat of Fawkner, becoming the youngest member of the House of Representatives at 27. In Canberra, he gradually built the most important relationship of his political life, with Robert Menzies. When Menzies became Prime Minister in 1939, Holt was brought into the ministry in a modest role, but one that was enough for him to learn how power operated. When the Second World War broke out, Holt briefly enlisted before being recalled to the ministry after the 1940 Canberra air crash that killed 3 cabinet ministers. The first time he really saw how fragile politics could be. The Menzies government lost office in 1941. The UAP fell into crisis, but Holt did not walk away. When Menzies built the Liberal Party in 1945, Holt immediately stood at his side. In 1949, the Liberal Country Coalition returned to power, and Holt held 2 key ministries: Labor and National Service, and Immigration. Here, he stood at the center of 2 major post-war shifts: a large-scale immigration program and the battles with the Union movement during the early Cold War. He also began, step by step, to loosen parts of the White Australia policy, though still within the security mindset of the time. In the 1950s, Holt's rise was rapid. Deputy Party Leader, Leader of the House. Then, in 1958, he became Treasurer. They're not a brilliant economist. He played a part in establishing the Reserve Bank of Australia and preparing for the transition to a decimal currency system. For more than a decade, Holt became Menzies' natural successor. On 26 January 1966, after nearly 30 years of persistence, Holt was sworn in as Prime Minister. But by the time he finally reached the highest office, the period allotted to him was far shorter than anyone imagined. Major decisions, invisible pressures, and growing health warnings began to stack up, setting the stage for the tragedy at Cheviot Beach, to be explored further in the next chapter. When Harold Holt took office as Prime Minister in early 1966, he became the face of a transforming Australia. On 14 February 1966, the currency change was put into practice. Pounds, shillings, and pence gave way to dollars and cents, a sign of economic modernization that Holt used as a symbol of a modernizing spirit. But the most lasting impression of his brief term came in foreign and defense policy. Under Holt, Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War expanded sharply. In 1966, he increased troop numbers and deployed a larger task force, including national servicemen. This brought Australia closer to Washington and triggered strong domestic opposition. His winter 1966 visit to the White House became a defining moment. Holt stood next to President Lyndon B. Johnson and uttered the famous line, "All the way with LBJ." In Washington, the remark was applauded. In Australia, it became shorthand for a prime minister seen as too close to America. At the same time, Holt stamped his name on a major positive change. The 27th of May 1967 referendum passed with more than 90% support, giving the federal government the power to make laws for Aboriginal people. An important step for Indigenous rights, and history remembers Holt as the man who announced the result. On the surface, Holt's term resembled an upward curve. A new currency, strengthened international relationships, and social reforms of significance. But beneath this sheen, cracks were widening. The Vietnam War dragged on, casualties mounted, and the anti-war movement surged, especially among young people and university students. Political controversy drew Holt into constant criticism. Placards, marches, and media pressure became part of daily political life. Holt himself was far from physically at his best. Nearing 60, he bore enormous responsibility, shuttling constantly between the capital and the major cities, chairing cabinet, hosting foreign guests, and dealing with the press. On top of that, he had health issues, a cervical disc problem that caused numbness in his right arm, pain that forced him to rely on strong painkillers, including morphine, just to get through the workload. Lack of sleep, fatigue, and slowed reflexes became part of his everyday reality. The tragic element was the sea, his escape. Holt loved diving, spearfishing, and swimming at remote beaches. He preferred to drive himself and disliked a permanent security detail. But Portsea and Cheviot Beach, favorite spots of his, had long been marked by lifesavers as dangerous. Rocks, rips, and treacherous conditions. In May 1967, Holt had a serious near miss when he inhaled water while diving and had to be pulled back to shore. He reportedly said it was the closest he had come to drowning. Those health and safety signals should have been taken far more seriously. The paradox of this period is clear. At the national level, Holt was steering a country into the modern era. At the personal level, he was slowly wearing down. When those two curves, rising power and declining physical strength, intersect, a single bad decision, one afternoon of ignoring warnings, is enough to change the whole story. That afternoon eventually came at Cheviot Beach. On the morning of Sunday, 17th December 1967, Harold Holt woke up at his holiday house in Portsea, the place he often retreated to when he wanted to escape Canberra's political rhythm. The plan for the day was very simple. Take friends to see a stretch of military-controlled coastline, stop at Cheviot Beach to watch the surf, then head back for lunch. No meetings, no media, no ceremony. Just a nearly 60-year-old prime minister wanting to enjoy a bit of sea air on a hot day. With Holt that day were his longtime companion Marjorie Gillespie, her 2 sons, a few friends, and a police bodyguard. They took an army jeep to a lookout over Cheviot Beach, a defense-controlled strip of coast usually closed to the public. From above, the scene was both beautiful and wild. Yellow sand, white surf, strong wind, deep blue sea. For someone who loved the ocean, it was an invitation. For lifesavers, it was a clear warning sign. Late in the morning, the group decided to go down to the beach. The wind was still strong, the waves pounded in. One person said bluntly, "The sea doesn't look good today." Another chose to sit back on the sand. But Holt, who had swum here many times and had almost drowned at this very beach a few months earlier, was still enthusiastic. He took off his shirt, left in just his bathers and canvas shoes, then stepped into the water. At first, the water was only up to his thighs, then his waist. Waves rolled in. Holt dodged them and kept moving further out on a diagonal line towards the rip that ran around the rocky outcrops. The waves kept building, at times swallowing his body in churning, sand-colored water. The people on shore continued to watch him until it happened. A larger-than-usual wave broke over him. When the foam cleared, Harold Holt was no longer where he had been. They searched for his head and shoulders in the swell, but saw only wave upon wave. Someone shouted. One man tried to swim out to help, but the current was too strong, forcing him to turn back to avoid being swept away himself. There was no thrashing, no visible struggle. The witnesses simply saw the Prime Minister disappear. One person ran up the sand dune to call the police and rescue services. Immediately, the whole coastline shifted into emergency mode. Police, surf lifesavers, soldiers, RAAF helicopters and Navy boats converged on Cheviot Beach. Helicopters circled overhead. Rescue craft ran along the surf line. Divers searched through the murky water below. Journalists arrived. TV cameras recorded each move. Holt's name was repeated over and over on radio, while newsreaders hesitated over how to refer to him. Prime Minister or missing Prime Minister? In the first few hours, people still clung to a slim hope. Perhaps he had been washed into a rock crevice and was waiting to be found. But the conditions, high surf, strong rips, submerged rocks, quickly stripped away that possibility. A middle-aged man on strong painkillers, with diminished physical strength, was almost certain not to survive long in such a hostile environment. The search efforts continued for many days. Divers battled near-zero visibility, with stirred-up sand hiding everything. They combed each rock cleft, but found nothing. No body, no scraps of clothing, no clear trace. Eventually, rescue teams had to narrow their search, then stand down, leaving Cheviot Beach to return to its deceptive calm. In Canberra, the government faced an unprecedented situation. A sitting Prime Minister, officially missing. Senior figures were called together urgently, and acting authority was handed to Deputy Prime Minister John McEwen. The official statement confirmed that all available evidence pointed to one conclusion: Harold Holt had drowned. For the public, though, that explanation felt far too ordinary. A prime minister who had stood next to the US president only months earlier, who occupied the center of the international stage, was now said to have died in a simple swimming accident? The gap between Holt's status and the simplicity of his death was too much for many to accept. Rumors spread. In the years that followed, theories sprang up. Holt had taken his own life under political pressure. Holt had escaped overseas with another woman. Holt had been picked up by a foreign submarine as part of a spy operation. Some even claimed he was assassinated and dumped at sea. But all of these stories lacked one crucial element: evidence. There was no sign of preparation for suicide, No suspicious financial records. No radar or intelligence data showing an unknown submarine. Decades later, when the Victorian coroner re-examined the case, the conclusion remained the same. Harold Holt drowned in extremely dangerous surf with deteriorating health, and possibly under the influence of painkillers. The absence of a body, however, turned the incident into a permanent blank space in the public imagination. Today, Harold Holt exists in history with two overlapping images: a prime minister during one of Australia's most turbulent periods, and a central figure in the most famous disappearance in Australian political life. In the final part, we will look at the legacy he left behind, his political shadow, his reforms, and the way the Cheviot Beach story has come to shape the nation's memory of Harold Holt. When rescuers were finally forced to abandon the search without finding a body, Australia had to do something it had never done before: hold a state funeral without remains. On the 22nd of December, 1967, St. Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne was packed with around 2,000 people, from international leaders to members of the royal family and Holt's own relatives. Outside, thousands more lined the streets to listen over loudspeakers. There was no coffin, only prayers and a very long silence for a man recorded as missing, presumed drowned. In Canberra, the political machine had to keep turning. On the night of the 18th to 19th of December, Governor-General Lord Casey invited John McEwen to serve as interim Prime Minister. A few weeks later, the Liberal Party elected John Gorton as its new leader. That handover marked the end of the long, stable Menzies era and the beginning of a period of revolving prime ministers. Holt became a broken link between two ages. Ironically, many decades on, the name Harold Holt is remembered more for the way he disappeared than for his decisions in office. In the public mind, Cheviot Beach tends to come up before decimal currency or the 1967 referendum. Conspiracy theories, suicide, defection, Chinese submarines, the CIA, spread widely but lacked evidence. In 2005, the official Victorian inquiry concluded that Holt had misjudged the danger of the surf and his own health, gone swimming in extremely hazardous conditions, and drowned. There were no signs of suicide or foul play. The way Holt is commemorated carries a distinctly Australian flavor, solemn, with a streak of self-mockery. A plaque stands on the clifftop, looking down at Cheviot Beach. Another sits on the seabed. A symbolic grave marker in Melbourne bears the words, "He loved the sea." And most famously, there is the Harold Holt Memorial Swimming Centre, a public pool named after a prime minister who drowned. His story has seeped into popular culture. The phrase, "do a Harold Holt," has become slang for disappear quickly. And TV shows occasionally splice in footage of him walking into the surf and vanishing into the waves. In the history books, Holt is often seen as a symbol of a shifting Australia, moving away from the old British orbit, entering a new era of close alliance with the United States, and facing fresh questions about national identity. His short term left three clear marks: support for the US in the Vietnam War, allowing the referendum on Aboriginal people to go ahead and win by a landslide, and then the disappearance that stunned the country. On the human level, the tragedy is simpler. A middle-aged man who loved the sea, in declining health, who had been warned but still walked into the water out of habit. One windy midday, a few painkillers, and a powerful rip were enough to cut through a life at the peak of political power. Today, whenever someone casually says they've done a Harold Holt, they're touching a layer of Australia's memory that's full of absence. Half joking, half haunted, and a reminder that there are leaders whose entire term can be swallowed by a single wave. Follow Farewell Aussie Stars to uncover the real tragedies behind the legends of another time.